It is, on behalf of Princeton, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the 5th Annual Princeton Colloquium on Public and International Affairs. I'm especially pleased to see so many alumni of the Woodrow Wilson School who have joined us to renew their Princeton ties this weekend. Today we can look forward to another round of stimulating presentations, one that will take us from the world of American politics to the world of international humanitarian activity. In bringing these worlds to Robertson Hall, the Woodrow Wilson School is seeking not only to explore the motivations of politicians, humanitarians, and other agents of change, but also to encourage all of us to act in ways that will improve the lives of others, whether they live next door or on the other side of the world. If ever a question needed to be asked and answered, it is the one that lies at the heart of this colloquium. What moves people to address the problems that confront society, to make the critical leap from awareness to action, from their armchairs to their public square? Why do so many people do little more than wring their hands when they read of genocide in Darfur or of struggling food banks in their own cities? And conversely, what persuades some to brave indifference and opposition to tackle seemingly insurmountable problems, such as keynote speaker and Nobel laureate Jody Williams' extraordinary campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines? How we resolve these questions will shed important light on the bases of civic engagement at home and abroad. And I would like to commend Anne-Marie Slaughter and her colleagues for coming to grips with this complex subject, and to thank our panelists and speakers for sharing their insights with us. I do have one bone to pick with Anne-Marie, however, and that is there is a very substantial body of knowledge in evolutionary biology about the evolution of altruism. And I would have thought, given that she has a colleague in Nassau Hall who is a world expert on evolutionary biology, that she might have thought to pander to me and invite me to give a 3-hour lecture on this subject. She has not chosen to do so, however, but I am trying to rise above it all and be gracious about this clear absence in the program. Now, one of the strengths of this annual event is that it taps the resources of our entire campus except Nassau Hall. Creating organizational and intellectual partnerships that this year include the Office of Religious Life, the University Center for Human Values, the PACE Center, and in the case of this morning's panel, the Woodrow Wilson Political Network, a student organization that brings together graduate students and alumni with a common interest in politics and policy making. I'm delighted that 3 distinguished public servants and alumni have agreed to be with us today. Jim Leach of the class of 1964, who nobly represented Iowa in Congress for 30 years and has now returned to Princeton as a visiting professor of public and international affairs. Bill Frist of the class of 1974, a renowned physician and 2-term U.S. Senator from Tennessee, who served as majority leader before returning to private life in January. And Eliot Spitzer of the class of 1981, New York's newly elected governor and former attorney general and ardent defender of the public interest. Each of these panelists took office to take action. And I would like to think that Princeton's strong commitment to service was one of the influences that launched them on this transformative path. And now I'm honored to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Iowa, who has kindly agreed to moderate our panel. Please give all 3 of our panelists the warmest of Princeton welcomes.
Well, thank you very much, President Tilghman. And you got it almost right. the mistake that our dean made in not inviting you, it was not because you're an evolutionary biologist, but all academic heads know far more about politics than anyone that might be in the public sector. In any regard, it's my honor to introduce two speakers, both graduates of this school, this university at least, and both also having craft degrees from Harvard, one in medicine and one in the law. Dr. Frist, as you may know, is considered one of the leading heart transplant surgeons in the world, and headed a heart and lung transplant center at Vanderbilt. Eliot Spitzer is a lawyer by training, worked in the private sector, two great firms, Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps, and also as an assistant Manhattan attorney and attorney general of a state. I'd like to make just two brief comments by perspective. Bill doesn't realize it, but he is my wife's favorite senator. And my wife did not know this till 2 days ago. And I received a phone call from a Los Angeles Times reporter. And by background, the last act of the last Congress before adjournment was a bill I'd passed in the House banning Internet gambling. And Bill, as a Senate Majority Leader, was able to tack it on to a Senate bill. And that's very hard. The Senate is the most... people like to say the greatest legislative body. Actually, it is the most anarchistic legislative body in the world. That is, any senator can put a hold on anything, which is rather bizarre and difficult to lead. But Bill, my family is so indebted to you because this Los Angeles Times reporter called and said that the gaming interests are now trying to change this law. And they've done a survey in my district that indicated that it was caused my defeat. And that is why my family loves you, Bill. And I want to tell you, I apologize. It's my mother's fault. She did not give me a deep enough voice. I'll try to speak more into this. In any regard, I think the end result of all things is just fantastic. By the way, in terms of Governor Spitzer, I want to put one bit of perspective before turning over to the two of you. We are seeing in the last month academic looking at the 19th to turn the 20th century reviews of the Gilded Age with analogies to today. And you're seeing people in public life looking at issues of equality, looking at issues of privileged in public life. Many people have started to speak to this issue. But if you take the panoply of public officials in the last several decades, there's only one that stands out in terms of standing up against Gilded Age values, and that's the former Attorney General of the state of New York. And I don't know anyone that fits this more than you do, Eliot. In any regard, in terms of protocol, and protocol there's always a very important place for it of things like who speaks first. And we have a governor and we have a private citizen, and so it's pretty self-apparent that the higher ranking is the private citizen. And so let me turn the microphone over to Bill Frist.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim, thank you, and it's great to be here today. And I just asked Jim, what are we going to do today? And I think what is most useful for everybody here is to do mainly question and answer, and us listening and you listening and responding back and forth. But I think our format will be just invented just a few seconds ago, is we'll each take 5 or 6 minutes and tell you a little bit about some thematics, and then we'll just jump right into discussions. Is that mine? In heart surgery, when that happened, I'd have to take off. Sometimes I have an excuse to take off, like if I'm at a long dinner and that sort of thing. And in politics, when I go off, I could always invent something. That's all. And Now that I'm back as a private citizen, I got to at least respond to it. Let me. I think the two thematics that I'd like to speak to today, and again, I will do that in a little bit later when we're talking, is number one, the citizen legislator, somebody who comes from real life experiences. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, sometimes in a profession that is very foreign to what I did every day as Majority Leader of the United States Senate, or as a senator representing 7 million Tennesseans. Apply those for a period of time, and then with that experience of 20 years doing something else, real job, real life, spending 12 years in Washington, D.C., and then coming back home. And doing that really planned and projecting out. That citizen legislator concept, I hope as we talk today, we can come back to again and again in terms of why that's important. Not for everybody, but why the richness and the mosaic of our government today demands that sort of broad interest, real-life experiences, coming in with the history of a real job, applying it for a period of time in an environment which is tough, it's competitive, it's fun, it's important, it's noble, but then not staying forever and voluntarily stepping away for a while. Again, not everybody, but why that's important. The second concept is that one that I actually ask your help on, and that is something that I've tried over the last 10 years to do, and that is to introduce medicine and health, quality of life, but in this case health and medicine, into public diplomacy, where we as a society and as a government and as a people can use medicine as a currency for peace around the world. Those two concepts I'll speak to real quickly because most of you don't know me or you have images of me. Let me just very quickly say that I grew up in the South, the last of 5 children. Dad was a physician, both of my brothers physicians. Health care is in the family. Dad grew up through the Depression, so took all those experiences with him and lived very humbly throughout his whole life. He died in 1988. And went to high school there, came to Princeton, had no relatives here, didn't know anybody at Princeton, didn't know any professors. I came here by myself for a visit, took a bus up and came to see Princeton. And my brothers and sisters all had gone to school down in the South, and my parents thought I was crazy in coming all the way up to a northeastern school like this. Spent 4 years here, was in the Woodrow Wilson School. Was also in a pre-med program here. At that point in time, it wasn't that common for somebody who knew they were going to go into medicine to come to the Wilson School, but I knew that I had both the international interest, or thought I had, as well as that interest in marrying medicine and health with public policy. I went to Harvard Medical School. I thought I was going to be going back home. Ended up going to medical school at Harvard because I got in. I was ready to go back home, but since I got in, I felt that I should go and wanted to go. Spent 4 years there, then did an internship in general surgery and 5 years in surgery. Then went to England for a year, worked for the National Health Service, employed by them for a year, and then went back to California for 2 years. I left Boston after being there for 10 years because Boston said no. Boston, which at the time, and still is, a great tradition of medicine and established medicine, and the aura of doing your training there and at Mass General Hospital was one that I loved. But they said no to an emerging new field called heart transplantation. At that point in time, heart and lung transplants had never been done. They made a policy decision, good policy, they all came together around a table in Boston, all the different hospitals and the medical schools, and said, no, we're not going to invest in this new procedure called transplantation, of taking the human heart out of one and putting it in another because it's too expensive. It's bad use of resources. It's not going to work. So I left Boston and went out to follow the dreams of one man called Norman Shumway, who at the time, since 1955, did the first transplant in a dog at the time, and stressed the importance of discipline, hard work, but more important that having a dream, of conceiving a dream, believing in it, and then doing it. Only person in the United States of America at that time. So left Boston, went out to the West Coast, and this conceive it, believe it, do it is something that has stuck with me. Doing things very simply, but getting them done. Then spent a couple of years there, then went back to Nashville and started a heart and lung transplant program. At the time I started that program, lung transplants had never been done. Within 2 years, we were doing lung transplants, and now it's done commonly. Heart-lung transplants, 3 had been done in the world. We started doing those. They're done commonly now. Neonatal heart transplants, transplanting hearts in babies 5 and 6 days of old, had never been done. All that happened in a period of about 8 years. Again, conceive it, believe it, do it. Then in 1993, having never run for public office, never served in public office, no political people in my family, no political tradition other than a willingness to serve, decided to run for the United States Senate. Didn't know any senators at all. Howard Baker had been Majority Leader of the United States Senate, but I didn't know Howard Baker. I went to see him and sort of systematically said, how can one convert healing one-on-one, which I had done, to healing one on the health of a community? Is it community service in a school board, or is it a mayor, or is it governor, or is it run for the United States Senate? I didn't know, had no experience with it, but decided because of the global interest that the best place to go was the United States Senate. And again, conceive it, believe it, do it, jumped into a race at the time. Timing was right, very lucky, and with that, I got in the United States Senate. Once I got to the United States Senate, started 100th in seniority, and once I got there, I didn't know really what the rules were, so I kind of said, where are we going to go in terms of trying to bring people together? What issues am I going to concentrate on? And then 7 years later, became Majority Leader of the United States Senate. Not because I earned it, not because I did any great things, but in large part, I think it's because of the trust that people developed in me in pulling people together. Served 4 years as Majority Leader of the United States Senate. And in my campaign in 1993, I did what was pretty much unheard of in the Senate. You hear it sometimes in the House, but it said I'm going to serve 2 terms in the United States Senate as part of my platform, and then I'm going to come home and live under the laws that are passed. The citizen legislator concept. Interesting in that there's been 1 senator elected to the United States Senate from 1950 to the year 2000. The 50 years before that, there were 5. The 50 years before that, there were 12. And the 50 years before that, there were 23. So at one time, physicians, the citizen legislator concept, at one time, physicians played a prominent role in our government, but it's kind of diminished for all sorts of reasons. Last thing, and I'll come back to it, is medicine's a currency for peace. I spend 2 weeks every year in some part of the world doing surgery. Not as Majority Leader, I take no security, I go by myself, maybe with one other physician. The parts of the world that I am in are Darfur, are Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, 13 African nations that I've operated in and done surgery in. I find the beauty of that, or the benefit to me, is that on the ground you talk to real people, get their feelings. The reality in a hospital, it's not partisan, there's no liberal, there's no conservative. People tell you what they need, and then reemerge back in Washington, D.C., interact with President Kagame of Rwanda, talking about genocide issues at the same time you're addressing Darfur, writing the Sudan Peace Act, participating in HIV when you're taking care of patients on the ground, taking it to the President of the United States and saying, Mr. President, we need $15 billion over the next 5 years. That sort of transfer, again, feeds into medicine as a currency for peace because it brings understanding and tolerance and peace to an area which we can talk about later, and at the same time using medicine and health as that tool, as that currency. So that's a little bit on background. Those 2 thematics we'll come back to. It's been a great journey for me. It's an unfinished journey. I have a lot to do, and in our discussion, I hope to take some instruction on how to spend these next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. I want to begin actually by thanking the Senator for his years of service. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. It is quite a story and a tale and a journey from school to medicine to transplant surgeon to United States Senator, Majority Leader, and it's a journey that I think we all admire, and I think that the notion of citizen legislator is the right one. And I can tell you that as an executive who was always looking over the legislative branch, I wish more of them would become citizens once again. It's there is this tension that I've only recently begun to appreciate between the executive and the legislative branches, and it's something that I'm only, I may write about that someday. It's they're always proposing term limits for us and we for them, and there's a reason for all this. But I do want to say it's still a little odd for me to come back to Princeton and stand on this side of the lectern. I can remember, I think the 5th row up on the aisle seat was where I sat when I was in the U Council, and I had an interchange with President Bowen about some disciplinary rule. I forget what malefaction of some poor student we were trying to defend, but I remember that interchange. The notion that I'm now on this side of the lectern is a little bit anomalous to me, but it's an honor to be here. And Senator Frist, I have to say, the school is much better today than it was when I was here. Alyssa, daughter, who's 17, came down with me this morning, and we got here, we were hungry, and I said, gee, I don't know if there's any place on campus to get breakfast. And we found the Frist Center. And so we are, I'm telling you, it is, if you, it's, if you come to New York and run for the Senate, I'll vote for you. It's, well, let me go on for a couple moments about how I ended up where I am today. It's not quite as circuitous a journey, or perhaps an unusual a journey, as from medicine to politics. I was, as I just mentioned, the U Council here, and so some people say, gee, you always wanted to be in government in some way, shaping policy. I don't know if that's right or not, but I will tell you, when I saw I see Anne Marie is saying yes, of course, but when I saw the title of the forum, which is From Passion to Politics, it struck me as kind of not odd, but appropriate. But the slogan, in campaigns you use slogans. Last year when I was running for governor, the slogan that I had on the ads, TV, and posters and all the rest, it's kind of meaningless perhaps, but was bring some passion back to Albany. Now, nobody here probably thinks about Albany and passion in the same sentence. It's, they're almost, it's an anomalous thought. And in fact, when I mentioned this to a very well-known marketer whose family company really survives on marketing high-end products, he looked at me, he shook his head, and he said, no, bad idea. I said, why? He said, well, people will misinterpret passion and think there may be something more scandalous in what you're suggesting. And I said, no, not in the context of Albany. It is so devoid of that it's, they won't worry. But the notion is, how do you bring back some of this emotional energy to a governmental process that has, I think, been lacking over the last number of years? And I don't say that to be critical of any individual or any party or partisan perspective, but how do you bring back a content and ideological content to what has often become just bickering? And so to bring that back to the question, why do we get involved in government? Why do you get involved in anything? What I have discerned over the years, and actually my college roommate first suggested this dichotomy to me. He said, there's some who get into politics because it's a profession, and there are others who get in because it's a cause. If you get in because it's a cause, and you actually have a set of values and objectives that you want to drive towards, then you will bring a determination and a rationale to what you do that goes beyond mere self-preservation. And what the senator talked about in terms of limiting himself to 2 terms, I think is remarkable. All facetiousness aside, being very serious, the notion that you have a task at hand, that you have to approach it every day because there's a limited time frame, so accomplish what you're there to do. And whatever it may be, obviously I have a discrete set of values that I want to see effectuated through what I'm trying to do and what I did as Attorney General, but go as a cause. There are so many legislators and members of the executive for whom survival and re-election is the end in itself. And what that leads to is the compromises and the lack of ideological content and the downgrading, the descent to a lowest common denominator in governance that has driven the public away. What I want to see on either side of the aisle, let's have some ferment, let's have some ideological battles where we can frame a debate and say what are the values, the virtues, the disagreements, and vote based upon those. And elect people who, when they get there, actually want to accomplish something. And so when people come to me and say, gee, should I get into government, I say to them, why are you doing it? If the reason is, well, it looks like it's kind of interesting, it could be better than the job I have, I say, don't get into it. Because I can tell you, there are long days, it's exhausting, you have to be nice to a lot of people you really don't want to be nice to. And reading my own newspaper clips, I'm told I'm not very good at that sometimes, and so that's, but if you want to get in because you want to accomplish something, then it is, I think, the best opportunity in the world. Now, when I got to the Attorney General's office, and the reason I ran for that and had not run for any office prior to that is because of my background as a lawyer. I was trained to see the law, and I have, just as the senator sees medicine, and rightly so, as this wonderful opportunity to bridge cultural divides. And my brother's a neurosurgeon, also Princeton grad, is a neurosurgeon and is doing wonderful things. And I have enormous respect for the technological side of the world. And I think, somebody, in fact, a reporter asked me a couple weeks, months ago, doesn't really matter, whom I admired most in the world, and I began to list some people who had changed the world by means of technological advances. And he looked at me surprised and said, well, isn't it the great elected officials? And I said, no. The reality is the world changes more by virtue of technology than political theory. And so technology, whether it's heart transplants or neurosurgery or the internet, whatever it may be, those are really the fulcrums in society. So that is where transitions can occur. But if you are trained as a lawyer, as I am, and you see a world where you think we need to shift the direction of social policy, it struck me that the law was the vehicle that I knew how to use to move us there. And as Jim and the President alluded to in their introductory comments, what I saw was a world which had been, for many years, I think one of the great creations of American society over the last 50, 60 years was the middle class. We bridged racial issues to a certain extent, not perfectly, but we created a middle class. We became what I called, and what others had called, I didn't create the notion, a bell curve society, where more and more of us were congregating towards the middle, where we could work hard, live well, our kids could do better than we, but we all did reasonably well. And there was a common set of values that drove us towards that, and a governmental policy that drove us towards that. What I see today, and it may be inevitable because of technology and the way globalization and the world economy is moving, but what I see today is that we are becoming less a bell curve society, more a barbell society, where you have a bump on either end, a depressed middle, and really enormous wealth and significant poverty, and we're moving in the wrong direction. I don't know how we overcome that necessarily, but one of the consequences of that has been what the President called these Gilded Age values and the distortive behavior that I saw permeating various areas, not only the marketplace, but the environmental policy, different policy arenas. And it struck me that as Attorney General, we could begin to confront that. And we tried. There was an overarching thematic that tried to unify it, and in others were more important than I, certainly. But that's why when I looked at Wall Street, I said, and people misinterpreted it. Many people said this was a populist crusade. It wasn't. It was an effort to ensure that we all played by the rules, that we all understood what the rules mandated, decency, fairness, and opportunity for all, and then we will get the greatest wealth creation and the greatest opportunity for everybody to succeed. And so the areas that we targeted on Wall Street were areas where I saw people gaming the system in order to take for themselves opportunities that should have been given to others or that had been rightfully earned by others. Or in the environmental context, maybe we could have a discussion about this new source review cases, which were remarkably, the Duke Power case that was a 9-0 decision out of the Supreme Court shows you that the unanimous decision out of this court is a rare thing. We were right in our interpretation of the Clean Air Act. We began those cases, I guess now about 8 years ago, in order to say, wait a minute, the law says to the power companies, you cannot put these pollutants into the air, you're violating the law. Nobody was enforcing this statute. We went into court, struggled for many years, and have received, I think, significant vindication, not only environmentally, but also in terms of our statutory analysis. Or cases that got virtually no attention are low-wage labor cases, where we would find workers who were being paid less than the minimum wage. By and large, immigrants, many of them illegal immigrants, which made them the consummate victim. These were individuals who were desperate for a job, any job, and when their employer said, I'm only paying you $2 an hour, and they were working 60, 70 hours a week, they had no recourse. They couldn't go to government because they were fearful that if they approached any governmental body, suddenly INS would show up, they'd be deported. And we said, wait a minute. That violates our rules of decency and fairness. They, too, deserve the protection, not only of the minimum wage laws, but the other laws that were designed to protect them. So we brought those cases, recovering numbers that in the context of the Wall Street cases seemed de minimis. But a $12 million recovery spread across a couple hundred workers was a life-changing event. A $1.4 billion fine spread across the totality of mutual fund holders was a few pennies per shareholder. It was important in terms of the principles that we were able to re-inject into the market, but for the workers, the low-wage cases were enormously important. So those were the values that sort of drew me to that job, and then somehow I ended up as governor, which is a different job with a different set of tasks. But we're trying to do the same thing. In terms of, we just, in our budget that we were able to pass April 1, we have a sort of a very tight time frame, increased our funding of public education by $1.8 billion. That's the delta, that's the increase, to bring us to $19 billion statewide, an enormous increase, which will hopefully begin to bring us towards a public school system that works. So we have many tasks that we can talk about, but in terms of the notion of bringing passion back into politics, I believe that that is the right name for the symposium, because what we need is that sense of values. And whether you agree with my values or not, the notion is be drawn to this by a desire to do something that is going to be life-changing for those whom you will affect. That is what should draw us in, and I actually happen to agree. I mean, your 2 terms were 12 years. I frankly can't imagine being governor for 12 years. I think that the calluses would build up to such a depth that you'd lose your capacity to make sound judgments. I really think 2 terms as an executive is all one can reasonably perform within. Thankfully, there are no terms for the presidency of Princeton, so Shirley, we're not releasing you ever. But in terms of being the governor of a state, I can tell you 8 years is probably all one can serve without losing that sense of passion and desire to effectuate a set of policies that I hope will be the right one. So let me stop there and turn it over to back to Jim. Thank you.
What we're going to do is turn this over to questioners, and I will just make one fractional comment, and that is, Governor, after 2 terms as governor, there are other executive positions too, and that does apply to former senators as well.
Only senators run for the presidency.
Well, I don't know that. Anyway, we have 2 terrific students. I'm going to ask you to carry the mics to people, but before that, I would like you to introduce yourself, please. Your name is?
I'm a second-year student at the Woodrow Wilson School.
Please.
My name is Ashley McCants. I'm a first-year MPA at the Woodrow Wilson School.
Wonderful. Good. Thank you. We're going to turn to the audience for questions, and our 2 students are going to give you a microphone. Yes, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Kate Sheriff. I'm a second year in the MPA program here. And I just wanted to ask both of you, thanks very much for coming. And I guess, Governor Spitzer, your comments about being ideological and having passion in politics made me think about the balance between how you can achieve that without making it become this, partisan bickering and struggle. And how do you maintain that balance? How can you bring your passion to government service, but still get along with others, I guess?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. Here's what I can tell you, and the reality, the position I have now requires much greater compromise and coalition building than did my role as Attorney General. As Attorney General, I was to a certain extent a unitary decision maker. I would bring my cases, go to court, win or lose. Even though we negotiated settlements, there was a fact finder to whom I could appeal. That's the court. And so I felt comfortable that if we were right, we would prevail within, with their judicial error, of course, but the judiciary, in my mind, frankly, it's my most revered branch of government because it is dispassionate and it usually gets to the right point. So in that capacity, it was easy. Now, as governor, you're right. I have an obligation to work with legislators with whom I do not always agree and try to bridge a chasm that can be sometimes quite substantial. In the budget process, we had to do that. Now, we were able, nonetheless, to forge compromises. You use different deadlines. You have carrots and sticks as the executive. There are trade-offs that one makes. I give you 2 examples. One of the important things we did in education finance was increase the amount of money that we would spend, which is necessary, but also embed statutorily a formula that will allocate the money in New York State based upon need rather than based upon the political power of individual legislators. Now, in order to get from here to there without such disruption to certain districts that had depended upon revenue streams and political realities, we had to compromise. And so we added additional dollars that would make it possible to get from here to there, arguably, theoretically violative of the formula we were putting into the statute, but a necessary way to make the statutory allocation, need-based allocation, work over the long run. So I did that. Is it pure? No. But did we get 80% of what I want? Yes. Partly as a consequence of that, we were able to get, in our budget, $600 million of funding for stem cell research. which is something I've been pushing for a long time, and for which there was not necessarily much political support in the state Senate. And we were able to make trade-offs among issues that don't necessarily appear to be related, but when you make a budget and there's so many moving parts, you get things done like that. So there's a lack of purity, which sometimes causes agita among the purists out in the media. And their job is to be pure, my job is to get the job done. And so you understand that tension, but you get comfortable with those sorts of compromises, and you have to understand that even though you're right, there's also a tension between a desire to be ideological and bring passion and the need to get things done. So you bite hard, you make compromises, and you just hope that you're getting most of what you need.
I'll just comment very briefly because I know we're going to have a lot of questions. It's been fascinating for me as a physician and from a heritage of being a physician with my dad. My earliest memories are going around where he would be making rounds in his car, and I'd be young, my arm propped up in the right seat of an old beat-up Chevy, and his doctor's bag sitting right there. And then watching him go in, and immediately the relief on somebody's face when somebody is coming to help them. That image sticks with me because it really comes to the objectivity which is important in making a diagnosis. And if there's one thing that's missing, or I found missing in Washington today, is the ability to, in an unbiased way, it can be partisan, and it needs to be based on principles, but in an unbiased way, making a careful diagnosis, no matter who comes in the room, what they have, what the color of their skin is, what their socioeconomic position is. You make the diagnosis, develop a treatment plan, you treat, you care, and then you're held accountable. The accountability is something I hope we'll get to later, because that's one of the things missing today. I mention that because when you're elected to the United States Senate, you do so, as we all are, with party support. And with that, you are, yes, pigeonholed in a certain way, but it does give a good contrast for the ideas. And once you're elected, whether it's in the executive branch or in the legislative branch, you do your best based on your convictions and principles to rule and to govern with meaningful solutions. Now then, with me, that became, again, with this bias and this push of objectivity of being a physician and representing everybody, you become majority leader. Majority leader, all of a sudden, again, leadership pushes you back out a little bit on the barbell analogy, where I represent 55 Republicans at the time, or say 50 or 55 Republicans, and my job is to lead them in that center of gravity, which is a huge variety of people, but they elect you to lead them consistent with their center of gravity. They don't elect you unless they think you can do that, and then push ahead, and then that pushes out to the partisanship. Now, that has introduced problems today in part where there is a lack of civility in Washington, D.C. And I say that, and people say, no, it's always been that way, but it didn't used to be that we would have war rooms, quotation marks, articulated by leaders in the United States Capitol, set up right off the floor of the Senate with a purpose is to define, and however you want to, the other side. That is what we need to pull back down, and I think it's going to take the executive leadership to break through that at this point in time, because it has gotten so bad in terms of an inability to really govern with meaningful solutions to the real problems that all of you see. And that, again, coming back to what Eliot said, is that there is a distaste for what goes on in policy. I call it a noble profession, and it is, and we're dedicating our lives to do that. But among the American people looking at it, unless we can come back to the dignity, respect for individuals, and civility, people are going to get pushed further and further away. And then the election process gets to be important, because I think this next executive, whoever it is, and the president, is going to have to push hard to pull it back, and that will affect the executive branch.
Can I just add one thing? Let me pick up on what the senator said, which is so right, and your metaphor of a medical diagnosis is, I think, a good one. So often in the political battles that breed the emotions, and look, I'm now speaking in favor of passion and emotion, but often that obscures facts. And what you have at the foundation of any medical diagnosis, one hopes and presumes, is an agreed-upon set of facts, the data. That's what the doctors do. They go and, what are your vital signs or not? What we all too often miss in our political discourse, behind the haze of rhetoric, is that there should be an agreed-upon set of facts from which you can then argue values or positions. But let's get to those facts. And I'll give you one brief example. We took an issue, which is sort of, for most people, a mundane issue, the issue of workers' comp reform. In New York State, it's critically important to our economy, manufacturing. For 10 years, there had been two rhetorical worldviews fighting at each other, And they had never agreed upon a set of facts. When I was elected, the day after, November 8, I got the relevant people together in a room, and I said, we're going to spend the next 2 months going back and doing what they taught us to do here at the Wilson School. We took the entirety of all the cases litigated over the last 2 years and studied them and said, now what do they tell us in terms of the facts, costs, burdens, upside, downside? And then we got a compromise. And we were able to get that compromise because both sides that had been really rigid in their positions looked at a common set of facts and said, here's where we go. So I think what the Senator is saying about using facts as your foundation and then argue values is really the way we have to go.
This gentleman right here had a question.
That's not me.
My name is Sujit Bhalla. I graduated in 1972 from the MPA program. And I'm based in India. And I want to bring and I'm an aspiring politician. I want to be a politician one day. But what I want to bring up is the following. And this is a developing country perspective, this is India, but I think there are some things that are common. That Rajiv Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, way back in 1985, said that only 15% of government expenditure that was meant for the poor actually reached the poor. And recent analysis indicates that Rajiv Gandhi was a wild-eyed optimist. So my question is this, that there is, in India at least, people take on profit. What is the taking office to take action is the theme of this seminar. In India, you take office to make profit, literally. Okay? And what one needs is that one makes the money and then goes into politics, and then you'll have, I think, good policy. So what a question is for the Woodrow Wilson School, especially where I learned and enjoyed on public policy and its importance. The reason there is distaste for politicians, and again, very much a developing country perspective, is that the politicians are not there to serve the people. Now, how can we try and improve the Rajiv Gandhi index from about 15% to even 40%? And lastly, to conclude, the question comes up, who will regulate the regulator?
Your turn.
Well, let me comment on our political system and what I found. And again, although people envision me being a majority leader part of the establishment and all, my heritage is such that I am an outsider now. Now I'm really an outsider because I'm outside of the elective process and stay involved with the policy. And what I found coming fresh to the United States Senate with 99 other colleagues is a real commitment to service. And again, I'm speaking for the Senate, I'm not going to speak for the House, executive branch, anywhere else. But I can tell you from my standpoint, my net worth fell over the 12 years pretty remarkably. And I didn't go there concerned about that, but it's hard for me to imagine today, and they're going to be the exceptions and they're going to be in the news, that somebody would go to the United States Senate for any sort of financial remuneration today in our process today. And there are going to be exceptions. You'll be able to look back, and obviously there have been some things even recently. But for the most part, here, that's not the rule. Anyway, it's important for me to say that. I have nothing to gain by telling you that today in the United States, and there are exceptions. So that commitment to service is there. I think one of the challenges we're going to have in our government, looking at Washington today, why would anybody go into public service or go to Washington, D.C. as a United States Senator or as a House member today? Because of the not just the things that have happened, but the lack of respect of those offices themselves. So I'm very concerned about that. Going back out to the earlier question, I ran the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is the political arm of the United States Senate. And both the Democrats and Republicans have these huge political operations. And part of what we do is recruit people such as you to run for our United States Senate. It's very important. If you don't have a good person in there, it's really hard to win races today. Money really doesn't do it. Even the campaign ads really don't do it if you don't have a good fundamental person. And my experience over the last 6 years, it's getting increasingly hard to say, give up, your net worth is going to probably fall, you're likely to get investigated, you'll have war rooms up after you, your family's going to be exposed fully, you'll be pigeonholed in ways that will affront your character and integrity, and it's getting increasingly hard.
Let me just add a few thoughts. And I agree with the Senator. I think the vast majority of those who are in public service are there for the right reason. It's easy to caricature based upon the rare examples, and I don't know if the 15% would be anything close to accurate here in the States. I hope we do a little bit better. I think we have perhaps a longer history in terms of trying to structure programs. But more fundamentally, your question is, are people there for the right reason? I wish they were there for pure reasons, as do you. I don't think most are there because they're corrupt, just the opposite. I think they're there because it's interesting, they think they can do something good. They're not as driven as I would like to see them be. When I was in Albany early on in my tenure as governor, significant counsel to a very significant person there came to me and said, Eliot, you don't understand. There is no ideology, there are only interests. And that was a very disconcerting moment. And I said to him, no, we've got to reassert ideology because that's what this should be about. So I agree with you. There is a tension and there's a disparity between the ideal and what we have. But having said that, I think most of us who are there are drawn to it for basically the right purpose. And, of course, we can do better.
This gentleman up here.
Ben Chan from the MPA from the class of '93. We've talked a lot about the lack of civility, the decline in the civility of politics, and the many things that politicians go through in terms of the scrutiny of their personal lives and being attacked. And it's obviously got to be a tremendously bruising experience for anybody in public office today, and bruising for your families. And how does one, in your position, how do you deal with that on a personal level, and how do you get through that day to day? And what advice do you have for people who are interested in public office but are wary about making that type of personal sacrifice?
It's actually easy. You save a lot of money. You don't read any newspapers. It's you develop a thicker skin, and there are days when I've shielded some of the articles from my kids because I don't want them to think, gee, Daddy did that. But at the end of the day, as long as you believe, and this is what I've always derived comfort from, no matter how vitriolic the editorial of the newspaper, the so-called news reporting would be on the other side, as long as I believed what we were doing was right, I didn't care. I would just laugh, and I actually also said to the folks in the office, there was a period of time where the Wall Street Journal editorial page, at least once every other week, would write this vitriolic screed about what I was doing. And I joked. I said they saved me a membership in a health club because I got my cardio workout. Senator Frist, just reading their editorial page every day. But and I stopped trying to reason with them at a certain point. But as long as you're comfortable in your values, that's the nature of the battle that goes on out there. As long as it was disagreement about substance, it didn't bother me a bit.
And I'll just jump in. I think to be successful in politics and to enjoy it, you keep the passion there. It's not a thick skin means don't pay attention. I think it's really more of putting everything in a much larger perspective. And all of you, everybody has their own frameworks and their own strengths and weaknesses there. With politics, you examine it, or you have to, because it becomes public to the world. There's not one thing in the last 12 years of my life that I'd have to live with. It'll be on the front page of the New York Times if it's there. And with the internet and Facebook and all the things today, even young people have to think about that. The framework, traditional framework for me is faith and sort of the family and friends and fitness. And faith is something, again, individual to all of you. But, I don't care who you are, you're going to come back and define that in your own mind if you're in politics, where you're constantly challenged from 7 in the morning to 11 at night, and accusations are made. And then family, people are blessed with it, some are not. Can't control who your parents are. Who you choose in life to be around in terms of friends is a very important part of what you do. Who you associate with, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or back in Tennessee. And then overall fitness, your fitness of mind and physical fitness, but fitness of mind. And that's a framework that I use. And if you're not fairly secure, or you recognize your insecurities in each of those areas, you can still be a politician, and you can probably still be a successful politician, but you're not going to be able to capture the passion in politics.
This gentleman right here. No, this one with the machine.
My name's Jack Henneman. I'm Princeton 83, Politics Department. I have a question for Congressman Leach, actually a remark first. I worked in your first victorious congressional campaign.
Well, thank you very much. Let me thank you.
As a 10th grader in Iowa City High School, I worked day and night for you. So it's great to see you again. And actually, the question sort of derives from that. It seems to me, as a sort of moderately interested observer in the news, that an enormous amount of the coarsening in the public discourse it derives actually from the House of Representatives, and that it's become harder and harder to unseat a member of the House of Representatives who has not been indicted, with the exception, actually, of one state, Iowa, which has adopted a nonpartisan mechanism for the drawing of congressional districts. I'm actually directing the question to you. I'd obviously be interested in other comments as well. But to what degree do you think that the computer-driven gerrymandering of House congressional districts has directly, in fact, influenced the coarsening of the public debate, at least in Washington?
Well, first, as an aside, because people mentioned technology earlier, arguably the two greatest inventions of the 20th century were the computer, the digital computer, and the chip, both invented by Iowans. I just had to get that out. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But having said this, coming right to your question about I know of no subject in politics that is less energizing, less passionate than the subject of redistricting. And the analogy to me is genealogy. Genealogy is absolutely wonderful within the family. Outside the family, nobody gives a hoot. And the redistricting process is such in the United States that there are 435 House seats, 480 are totally safe within the party. And about half of these are Democratic and about half are Republican. Now, what it means, because you ask, what does it mean for the body politic? Does it lead to a coarsening? One of the implications of it is, and I sometimes give a talk, that if you take America, we're about a third Democratic, a third Republican, a third no party. Half of a third, obviously, is a sixth. So a sixth control the Republicans, a sixth the Democrats. But 1 in 4 participate in primaries. That means 1/24th control the Republicans, 1/24th the Democrats. And that's pretty conservative on one side, pretty liberal on the other, on an American spectrum. In safe districts, you are far more likely to have the more conservative in the Republican district prevail in the primary and the more liberal in the Democratic district. And then the unique phenomenon that people have paid no attention to, everybody kind of understands in a presidential race, and let us pretend Bill runs as a presidential candidate on the Republican and Eliot on the Democratic. In the primary, you kind of move to your edges, and Bill will speak kind of the conservative side, Eliot will speak kind of to the liberal side, and in the general, they a little bit scoot to the center. I don't mean lose their principles, but you scoot to the center because that's where the battle becomes. In Congress, in these 380 out of 435 seats, if someone is elected from the right and someone from the left, you have no incentive to move to the center because A, your district is totally safe within your party, and B, your only challenge is within your party, which means from the edges. And so the aspect of no competitiveness misserves the body politic. Why does one want to participate if there's not likely to be a close election? And then secondly, you end up with a House of Representatives, and this is more true today than I would argue at any time in American history, that is philosophically more to the edges. And then the interesting phenomenon of that is, and this is more the House than the Senate, but it's becoming somewhat more true in the Senate, but particularly the House. If you put in your own mind the classic liberal Democrat and the new breed Republican conservative, they're different types of people, and they don't particularly like each other. And so you have a sociological phenomenon. Not only are you to the edges of the party, you have no incentive to compromise, and you're of an American spectrum that doesn't get along. And so you have in the House of Representatives an absolute breakdown of this word comity that people hear so much about. And the only way you get to it is to upgrade the importance of primary elections and to put reform in the redistricting process so you have more competitive races. But that is a very difficult thing, because you can say that abstractly. How you get to it, then you have to think through, do you want to have nonpartisan commissions write state redistricting lines? That's a possibility. Do you want to have judicial panels rewrite state redistricting lines? But you have to realize this also applies to state legislatures, and the people that write laws are legislators. And there's a self-interest, and there's no greater self-interest than your own career. And so one of the aspects I found in the House is that sometimes you can have respectful relations on abstract issues where you have differing views. But when it comes to career, campaign reform, redistricting reform, I mean, the knives come out. There's just no real desire to truly compromise. And so I think you need a kind of a national movement that puts elected people on the spot.
Can I add to that only in the following way? Because I think what Jim just said is brilliant in its analysis of what the problem is, and I wish the American electorate understood it, because that lack of drive to consensus driven by gerrymandering in the primary structure is really what has led to the gridlock on so many issues and the coarseness of the conversation. I only want to add, you referred to the fact that only when indicted would legislators lose. Back when I was a prosecutor, we brought some cases against a number of legislators in New York State. We stumbled on the fact that the re-election rate necessarily for incumbents was 98%. Those who'd been indicted, their re-election rate was 100%. So that one really threw us. I will say, in terms of the redistricting, obviously, as a senator and a governor, we don't worry so much about our lines being redrawn. But the thing I've said, we did threaten to take over an adjoining state at one point. That didn't go over very well. The thing I've said is that as governor, I do have to sign off on the the lines that will be drawn after the next census. And what I have said, and whether this will succeed, I won't know for a number of years, and if I'm still governor by then, is that I won't sign a redistricting statute that has lines that are driven by a desire to protect incumbents rather than to move us towards fair and competitive elections. So there's some executive role, but it's going to be very hard.
Turn to, yes, young man in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Josh Walker, and I'm a PhD in politics and public policy. And I focus on international relations. So having kind of America's elected leaders here, I want to take the opportunity to ask you a question more about international affairs. We've talked about kind of taking action on the domestic front in a lot of ways, and each of you referred in different ways to America's unique role in the international system. So how, as America's elected leaders, do you balance your role to your constituents, but also to humanity? Where do you draw that balance, and how do you, as America's elected leaders, take that responsibility on the world stage?
Well, let me start. And it really goes back to medicine as a currency for peace. What does that mean? Is it health? Is it public health? Is it medicine, delivering medicine? I came to the United States Senate after 20 years of basically doing surgery, fairly sophisticated surgery, but taking care of those patients long term. My international interest was pretty much limited to my studies here, international relations, while I was here. Since that point in time, over a 12-year period, I've traveled to 40 countries, 40, as a United States senator. People in Tennessee probably in around the country and through the media probably resent that. And it goes back a little bit to the question where technology media is. And the immediacy of that is why in the world, Bill Frist, you go to the bush in Africa and Uganda and spend 2 weeks of your valuable time when you should be running the United States Senate. And there are lots of ways to answer it, and we won't get into that, but it's actually easy to answer in terms of how it relates. So I think that's sort of a very superficial thing that we have to address. We need to encourage our elected officials today to get involved in the international aspects. Why? Part because of the computer you have in front of you and the internet and everything that happens in China and in India and in Europe and in Africa connects this oneness of mankind, this oneness of humanity today. I've used it in some interesting ways in that I started going into southern Sudan back about 8 months after bin Laden left there, and have gone back every year, spending time in the south and in the middle part up in the Nuba Mountains and the Pabong Delta where all the oil is, and down in the south. And when I first started going there, we started operating in a small little schoolhouse, and some of you have heard me say now that little clinic serves 60,000 people, so that's good. But even better than that, the civil war that was going on in southern Sudan has been resolved. We still have genocide. The Darfur region, where I have gone the last couple of years, it is terrible, but there is actually peace throughout the rest of Sudan. And in large part, it's established by the United States and the volunteers through mission groups, through faith-based groups, and our government working hand in hand together, bringing in understanding among the people there, symbolized by the fact if I'm treating somebody with an injury from a battle 14 kilometers away, it doesn't matter whether they're rebel, Sudanese People's Liberation Army, or government. Ultimately, they're the same. And that is what can actually be magnified. How do I apply that? I apply it, as I mentioned, over in Rwanda, spending time there on the ground, talking to people about reconciliation after genocide. It takes me, as leader of the Senate, to go over and talk and spend a period of time, whether it is in the memorials, which those of you who have been there know are all throughout the countryside, or talking to Kagame, or talking to his cabinet, but probably even more importantly, talking to the Hutus and the Tutsis who are there, who come to see you, and then taking that understanding right back to the floor of the United States Senate. And that's why I took and called it genocide in August of 2 years ago, took it to the floor before the State Department, before Secretary Powell, before the administration called it genocide, as a legislator took that resolution to the floor. And it was really based on those experiences. And I think, again, the citizen legislator, the willingness to get out, get on the ground, same way you're doing surgery and you're dealing with Medicare and domestic and international health policy and global health, the same sort of thing I want to see our legislators continue to do. And it applies to Iraq, to Syria, to North Korea, as well as to the African continent.
Let me just say very briefly, and I think what the Senator has just said is important and remarkable in terms of his capacity to use his position in that role. I think obviously the United States Senate has a defined role necessarily in the formation of our foreign policy, and it should, not to diminish the executive's primacy there, obviously, but not only through the approval process, but through the hearings and the capacity to push our foreign policy in Washington, something that I think we would all like to see more of today. As governor, I feel, frankly, that I overstep my bounds when I speak to those issues other than in limited contexts. I'm just not sure it's my role. I obviously have very deep-seated beliefs in that area. I'm not sure that we want 50 governors running around proclaiming foreign policy. It's a joke that in New York every elected official has a foreign policy. I mean, this is maybe that's true everywhere. Maybe it's just unique to New York, where we feel that we have a greater influx of immigrant communities and consequentially allegiances to nations around the world. But there is at a different level a very real impact that the globalization that we're all obviously familiar with has affected us in New York, and that is that our economy has gone through a remarkable transformation over the last 30 years. And what had been a very robust manufacturing economy in upstate New York with a service sector, financially driven economy from Manhattan north up to about mid-Hudson Valley, has been turned in the upstate communities on its ear. Those jobs have disappeared. And so we have been brought into the debate about globalization, trade, what it means, how do we transform ourselves in a very real way. Now, that is perhaps not directly responsive to your question or what the Senator was talking about, the issues in Darfur and elsewhere, but in terms of the international economic implications, we are grappling with those to try to figure out how we remake ourselves and build relationships with India or with China, the other centers of economic growth that you see will be explosive on a percentage. When you see the Chinese economy grew at 11.1% last year and it's continuing on that trend line, you say we need to build direct linkages there. And so we are doing that in a bilateral way that does not necessarily include Washington.
Young man.
Thank you. My name is David Christie. I'm a member of the freshman class here. My question is about the apparent sort of disconnect between planning and passion. Especially, you both spoke to candidates who are elected and want to implement plans of action. But it seems like there's sort of a divide between the candidates who have a mastery of rhetoric and are talking about the issues and have sort of an ideology and the ones with the 14-point plans to get things done. So maybe some of you on the panel or any of you on the panel could talk to whether that divide is real and how, if it is, we can overcome that.
Eliot would probably answer this best because he has a platform out there. It clearly comes from his passion. But I think it's a great point. And those of you who are in practical politics, the combat of politics, which is we love, and it is fun, it is hard, from the outside, again, it looks crazy. But the planning of it, you're exactly right, is not there for your typical candidate. And I've done a lot in terms of candidate recruitment, running races at the Senate level, a lot. I spent a lot of time with it. And again, it comes back to this technology question. And today, media, the 24/7, which is out there, thank goodness it's out there for the accountability and transparency. The surveys that are done, the polling that is done, and the development of campaign strategies done around that polling is huge. It's tremendous. And in part, it's how you win. You look at public opinion, not necessarily conviction, not necessarily passion, not necessarily principle, but every day people are feeding you information about where, if you position yourself here, a little bit goes to what Congressman Leach was talking about. You listen carefully to all these pollsters, and that shifts you in that direction, and then you shift back. And I think that is dangerous. It means when you get into this business, you have to be willing to lose. And I had a huge advantage because I was, doing heart surgery every day, and if I lost, that'd be fine. I'd go back and do heart surgery every day. A lot of people in politics don't have that opportunity. They get pulled a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, they lose a little bit of that principle, and then they follow with a campaign strategy that is developed over that 1.5 or 2 years. So what I look for is somebody who started the 2 years before that, who looked at their passion, what makes them tick, what makes them think, their convictions, and then as they come into that 2-year period before the campaign, yes, it's going to be colored and it's going to be shaped. Most candidates are coming at this without that long-term strategic planning, thinking about it, where they want to go, how they're going to get there, and are they going to be willing to pay that price to get there.
I guess I agree with your premise that passion can't be planned. It's sort of, if you're planning it, it's not so passionate. On the other hand, you can be driven to get into this because you have a pretty firm set of values and convictions about what you want to do once you're there, and then you can begin to sound like the technocrat and the Wilson School graduate who ticks off the 10-point plan, in a different setting, and when you're sitting in your office working with your Deputy Secretary for Health Policy, and you say, okay, how are we actually going to enroll the 400,000 kids that we just got authorization and funding for because we brought the passion to the budget process to fight for it? So you have sort of, it's not quite a schizophrenia about it, but you have to project that passionate element to, I think, create an argument and a foundation for a shift in direction. But then in order to effectuate it, you have to put on that sort of wonkish approach that hopefully is part of it as well. And even if you don't have it, you find people who do. Look, now I'm a generalist. I joke, I hope I joke, I'm a dilettante. In the sense, I can't possibly talk coherently about health policy, education policy, tax policy, and environmental policy. I can't assimilate all those issues and concerns. But what I can do as a governor, or as the majority leader can do, is find the people who really understand how to run DEC, my Department of Environmental Conservation, to get us from here to there. And so this is where, you bring the passion, you also bring, you hope, the intellectual skills to find the people who have the 10-point plan, the 12-point plan, whatever it is, to then join you in that effort.
I want to go up to the higher roles because I have been looking way up the top. The one with the highest hand. Go ahead.
My name is Jared Nicholson, and I'm an undergraduate in the Wilson School. And we were talking earlier about how we thought that it's not necessarily the case that people are getting into politics to make money. But I think oftentimes it's the case that people have to have made money or come from money to get into politics in the first place. And I think that has implications for some of what we were talking about today with like the role of the citizen legislature when only a tiny sector of the population can really take on that role, and also for competitiveness and stuff. And I think, so my question is whether you think that that's a problem for what we're talking about with the idea of taking office and to take action, and if so, what can be done about it?
Yeah, I think I'll start just at the Senate level. In the extreme cases, the real self-funders don't win. It's pretty interesting. The very wealthy self-funders, and they buy ads, and it's rare that they win the first time. But it is a problem today in terms of being able to buy media today to get your voice out. You either got to do it through, basically, starting up till about 3 to 4 years ago, the only way to do it was through network TV. We don't have to worry about the gerrymandering, but in a state like Tennessee, there's 7 million voters, sort of a typical state, 3 different divisions, 6 different media markets. How do you get your voice out? Now today, and this is where the technology is so exciting, today that's not nearly as important. The traditional media of paying people on the 3 networks right now, whether it's through cable or even more exciting through the internet and through blogging today, that voice travels, and it travels quickly. We're all struggling with the accountability of that voice and what's going on in the blogging world, and what can be believed, what not believed. But we're just, as a society, going to have to address that. It's going to be interesting in this presidential race right now, because one of the interesting things that is very local to me is Fred Thompson. And watch what happens here, because we have a candidate that could almost capture what Obama has on the Democrat side, and that is sort of going above it, capturing hope and dreams and aspirations. And I don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting right now at the presidential level. You have Fred Thompson. I get too much into politics, but Fred Thompson, who's a friend of mine who I talk to every day, and he has this acting career in the past, 8 years in the Senate, very qualified, but has spent no money, has no staff, has given no campaign speeches, and yet is either number 2 or number 3 on the Republican side right now. And this capturing goals and aspirations and dreams, we as a society have not done very well, I think, in the last couple of decades, really. And this will be an interesting election to see whether or not you can do it, to be able to cut through it. But the challenge of money is there, either in raising it once you're there, or having people around you raise it. You can't just be somebody with good ideas and make it to the United States Senate today.
The senator is right, but I would add this at a political level. I've heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true or not, that if Fred Thompson gets in, that our Democratic candidate is going to be Sam Waterston.
And he won't have to spend much either.
Yeah, he won't have to spend anything. But it's, I think the way you frame the problem is exactly right. And I think if you take the gerrymandering concern that we talked about a little bit before and the campaign finance issue, those are the 2 cancers that are really growing inside our political process from a process perspective. I'm hoping that technology won't be the answer to gerrymandering, but technology, as the senator said, could be the answer to campaign finance. And this will take probably another generation or so. But as we wean ourselves, as we are, I want to be judgmental about it, but as people move as we see the Nielsen ratings demonstrating that we are away from network TV as the primary medium or source of information towards an internet-based technology, I think we will probably see technology overcome the campaign finance issue before we overcome it statutorily.
I have to correct someone when they err, and actually Sam Waterston has given serious consideration to endorsing what's called the Unity 08 ticket, which is going to be a third-party ticket.
Really? I'll call him right away.
That may emerge in the next election. Which would be
I'm going to stop watching the show right now.
But not necessarily as a candidate, as for the precept of a third-party movement. And I'm going to have to add one other footnote. Frankly, politics today is about money of one's own or access to other people's, and any thinking American that isn't violently for campaign reform isn't thinking very deeply. You need to have public financing. And you can have public or partial public financing of elections, and if you don't have it, it absolutely constrains the number of candidates that come into the fold. And there isn't anybody that doesn't know people that haven't been constrained or themselves haven't been constrained about the problem of money in politics. And let me tell you the psychological dimension of it. For many Americans, the notion of asking someone, for example, would you consider giving a gift to a university, to Princeton, is an easy thing to do. But to say, would you please give me money, is not a natural thing to do. And I will tell you, I spent 32 years, I never asked anyone for a campaign contribution. Today, the modern politics is that candidates are told they have to spend an hour a day on the telephone, calling up people asking for money for their campaigns. What kind of person is that? I mean, I really... No, but what I'm getting at is, it's very hard. And you can't pay attention to the issues. It creates awkward relationships in our society. And the only way around it is some sort of public direction and campaigning. And here, by the way, an aspect of the legal profession has put some difficulties. It's called the courts. And the Supreme Court of the United States has declared in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo, for instance, that money is virtually the equivalent of free speech. And free speech is a near absolute right that has to be protected. Money in politics, to me, is not. And that too much money drowns out the political process. We have a individual from the governor's state who's hinting at plopping down record sums for a campaign. Record meaning hundreds of millions and maybe even the billion figure. And those are rumors. I have no idea if they're valid or not. And it's not the governor. But this is a very different nature of a political circumstance in our country. And I think we all have to think about it and what kind of system we want to have. But I will tell you, for example, I used to introduce a bill that's a constitutional amendment because of Buckley versus Vallejo. And all the amendment says is the United States Congress can put limits on what an individual puts in their own campaign, and state legislatures can put limits on what an individual can put into state or local offices. Without that, we're going to be increasingly a political oligarchy. Anyway, next question. Yes, sir. Yes.
I'm Jim McDonald. I'm class of 70, Woodrow Wilson School. And
Jim was head of the Bread for the World, one of the great advocacy groups in the world.
Right, so thank you. But I also think, not only did you not ask for money, you didn't take money from PACs during the course of your running, and I think that has set you aside as well, and I think people should know that and appreciate that about your own integrity. My question actually is about something, is movement afoot now to override the Electoral College. The governor of Maryland just recently signed a bill that would declare that the total vote for a president would determine how the electoral votes in that state would be cast. So it's not it's still in the kind of a symbolic gesture, but it would, instead of having a few states where there are sort of special, whether it's Ohio or Florida, where most of the campaigning was done, if you went to elect on the basis of the popular vote, then everybody's vote would count equally across the United States. I wonder if you could comment on that. Are you inclined to go along with that movement to override the Electoral College?
Well, I'll give you a short, direct answer to it. Sure, I think it would be great if we could get rid of the Electoral College. It's a vestigial limb in the Constitution that twists the outcome and distorts campaigning. I don't think we're going to get there soon because in order to repeal it through the traditional mechanism of a constitutional amendment, we would need to go back to those very states that gained from it and ask them to vote against self-interest, so I don't think it's likely to happen. Can we, there's an argument, and you referred to what Maryland is doing, there's some argument that state by state you could essentially direct your electoral votes that they be cast based upon proportionate voting within the state. The problem is that if you do that on a unitary basis when other states are not doing it, you put yourself at a double disadvantage. And so it's hard in terms of the game theory of getting from here to there. You're theoretically right.
Let me
it's hard
describe it if I can, Jim. I happen to be very close to what is happening, and let me describe it a little differently. What happened is an engineer at Stanford University came up with a technique that a few people have thought is kind of engaging, one being a former presidential candidate named John B. Anderson. And the technique is that instead of trying to change the Electoral College, which is a traditional way, that if enough states pass a law that binds the electors of the state to vote for the candidate who received the largest national vote, if you got states representing the majority of the Electoral College to pass this, and that it wouldn't come into effect until the majority of states or the states with the number of the majority of electors to pass it, then you have an effective change to the Electoral College outside the traditional constitutional system based upon a pact between states, or an implicit pact between states based upon commonality of legislative action. And you have two issues that are confronted. One is whether you want to keep the Electoral College. The second is how you change it. And both are two separate judgment calls. For example, an American might say they don't like the Electoral College, but they also have doubts about going around the Constitution to change it, which this does. On the other hand, this is technically an approach that scholars that have looked at it could well work. And Maryland is the first state to pass such a law. And so if you got a group of states that all passed a similar law, you have the effect of changing the Electoral College nomination. Yes, Bill. Okay. Thank you. We'll go to the, yes, ma'am. Last question this will be, and then we're going to break for lunch. Well, I want to go to a student. That's my rule here. Students come first.
Hi, my name is Kate Benner. I'm a freshman. And my question is, as we've moved more towards what Governor Spitzer described as a barbell society that's sort of become involved with the polarization of the politics. So my question was, how has that affected the government for the both of you, and how do you think you might change that?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I agree with the analogies, and I think it's been articulated in different ways by really all three of us. Number one, I think we've suggested that technology has a huge opportunity today and sort of the openness, and we need to make sure from a privacy standpoint, It's a little bit like privacy of medical records. A lot's being talked about in the last several days on the news. And so that I would continue to focus on, and in your studies and as you have discussions here, recognize there's a limitation, whether it is in the election process we just said, in campaign finance, as to how much government will do, right? Maybe not should do, but will do because of the realities that are there today. And therefore, we do need to use the public-private partnerships. We need to use the internet. We need to use technology. And we need to make sure that our elected officials are doing the same, so that you out there can contact the majority leader of the United States Senate directly in some shape or form, and technology has given us that today. Secondly, I think we need to look at things differently in transformational ways, and the way that I've introduced a little bit today is public diplomacy. We haven't talked very much about public diplomacy today, but we're in trouble in the United States in terms of public diplomacy. So we can keep doing things the way we have over the last 20 years or 10 years or 3 or 4 years, but that's not working. So we need to start thinking about that larger issue of public diplomacy, and instead of looking in traditional ways, look beyond that. And I've used medicine as a currency for peace, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, food programs, things on the ground where we touch the hearts of people, where we know when we're one-on-one with people we can break through that. And I think we can do that formally by injecting medicine or health as a formal part. It's not right now, not even really on the table of a formal part of our public diplomacy today. So I would think outside the box today to look at this problem. Otherwise, you're going to throw up your hands and you're going to walk away. And government itself is probably not going to solve those two problems today, or the legislative process will not.
Last comment for the
Can I
governor.
just make one very quick observation about your question, because I think you're right. It is one of the most vexing problems. And I'll answer it this way. I think perhaps the most challenging issue confronting us is the question whether, even if we do everything right in terms of investing in education, technological skills for our kids, upgrading our economic competitiveness, even if we do everything right, is the global marketplace necessarily affecting our domestic economy in such a way that this move towards a barbell society is inevitable, and wealth disparities will continue to increase because those who can maximize their own position in the global economy will be limited to a smaller percentage of our domestic population than was the case during the period from 1950 to 1990, when our comparative advantages were such that we really controlled everything. And that's an open question.
Well, let me thank two absolutely fabulous public servants, and to invite everybody to the George Schultz Dining Room, another Princetonian fabulous public servant, which is right behind this particular auditorium. Thank you all very much.